Today, I am joined by a very, very special guest who will be joining me for this episode of The 5 Books That Made Me, a series where guests cover the top books that shaped their lives and careers. And for this episode, I am chatting with one of my favorite journalists and storytellers, and also a dear friend, Gary Scott. And if you're someone who wants to tap into, say, your inner Woodward and Bernstein, or maybe even your inner Edward R. Murrow, this one's for you. Welcome back to Bookwise from bookclub.com. I'm Britt Brewer. A little background on Gary. I'm going to brag on him a little bit. Gary was the head of programming at NPR affiliate KCRW in Los Angeles for 8 years, and he launched the station's podcast network called One of the Most Interesting in the Biz by Hot Pod. Not a pornographic thing. It's actually just about podcasts. Gary has more than 2 decades of experience in audio and print as a writer, editor, producer, and news director. Currently, one of his many jobs, he serves as the producer for Small Town Dicks, an audio series that takes you behind the scenes of small town crime cases with the real detectives who investigated them.
Hey.
Welcome, Gary.
How are you?
I'm not good. No? Gary. No.
You're stuck in the corner. That's the problem.
Somebody put baby in a corner. Okay, so these are 5 very important books to you that have shaped your worldview. And first out of the gate is A Light in August by William Faulkner. This is a 1932 novel by the granddaddy of Southern American Gothic literature, William Faulkner.
I expected it to be sort of, it's a thick book, and I expected it to maybe be a toil, as a lot of books, and I think a lot of people, unfortunately, we don't pick up the big books because we expect them to be hard, or we don't pick up War and Peace because we expect it to be like, oh God, this is going to be a real snore fest. And it's really just about some intellectual pursuit that was from school and learning something, and there's some interpretation I'm supposed to do. And all of that, like being taught in school, is the most horrible way to engage literature, because as most of us experience, when you do open that book, you're like, wait, this is really actually very good. And that's how Light in August was for me. So it was transformative in that way, where I started to read it. And I'm like, this is a fascinating story. I love it. It's not an action book, but there's a man named Christmas who's on the run. He's black and white at a time when being black, obviously, in America is very dangerous. But this was sort of that book that told me, like, take a breath and really think through, like, what is really happening in society? What is really going on? And so it was an awakening for me to be like, okay, I get this now. I get, this person who's black and white, and the coding of both of those things within society, that he didn't use that language, but just, you could see, here's a human being who could pass as white and could do certain things, but if he was black, he couldn't do those things.
Right.
And it's a well-written book. It's a fascinating story, all that stuff. So you're also, the beauty of any literature is that you're giving all of this story to me in this most compelling, beautiful way. And when I come out of it, I can't deny that I actually need to start thinking a lot harder about what it's like to be somebody that doesn't look like me. Right.
So you are forever changed because you, in a way, were able to, through the story, experience someone else's perspective.
Yes. Because, the brilliance of that is that you absolutely relate to the person as a young white reader because he's part white.
Yes.
And this sort of mystery of being black. And you're like, well, what parts, the shadow and light, it's not even just necessarily the race thing. What parts of me do I have to hide? What parts of me am I ashamed of? But maybe I shouldn't be ashamed of. What parts of me don't let me get past certain things and to experience certain things in life?
Some of you might know Joan Didion as she is a writer that a lot of white women in California like to post about. She's also a brilliant writer and essayist. Gary, why don't you chat a little bit about what you know about Joan Didion?
Slouching Towards Bethlehem is the first collection of stories I read from her. The first story in that book is Some Dreamers of a Golden Dream. And Some Dreamers of a Golden Dream is about a woman who kills her abusive husband, and it is set within within at least a half mile of where I actually grew up.
Okay.
And it's sort of on the downslope of coming out of the San Gabriel Mountains into the valley of San Bernardino. And it was a place called Alta Loma. I don't think she ever uses that name. Rancho Cucamonga, as anybody who loves Bugs Bunny might remember. It's out that way. It's out in the Inland Empire is what we call it today. And, you know, she starts off talking about the Santa Ana winds and the location. And, you know, for your ASMR fans, it gave me the tingles. It's like, this is where this is what I remember, you know, those sense memories of a place. And the story itself is tragic. It came at a time when I think, you know, whatever her politics, it's that, it's the new journalism where she obviously is giving you a lot of framing, that's different from your straight newspaper report.
Right.
But it is also delivered in what I would still call like a world of objectivity, which is she doesn't come to a conclusion saying, look, guys, we really need to change things.
Right.
But instead lets this tragic, small, who knows any of these people, who cares about any of these people, something happened. It's probably a headline, maybe for a day in a newspaper, because while it is tragic, it's, you know, it's not the trial of the century. But she's like, no, you need to actually process society through this story. Because actually, if you think about it, you know, this whole, and that's what I think she did so well, you know, and what writers like Joan Didion do so well is that little thing that you thought was interesting and you kind of passed it and you're like, oh, that could be interesting, but I'm going to move on. She was the genius. She was a genius at going like, no, stop. That's actually the thing we should stop and talk about. That's the thing we should do more research on. And so the story itself, and there are more stories in it, but this is the one I'll talk about, is this confrontation that today may not even seem so controversial, but was in the early 70s when she wrote it, of this woman is being beat by her husband. What is she supposed to do? Yeah. The police aren't coming to take him away. But she trusted the audience enough it was not editorialized upon, I guess is what you're saying. Right. It's the choice. It's the choice of like, I'm pointing my gaze at this thing and I'm going to spend a lot of time on it. I'm going to give you a lot of detail. So it must be important, right? Right. And you can imagine, yes, it's about an abusive woman who kills her husband. And it's at a time when women's rights was just emerging as a serious conversation outside of like protests, but actually like we need to start doing things about this. Not the first time, but you know, a wave of it. Yeah. And what does it mean to the domestic life? The thing that's happening in a house that's on a normal street in a place you probably never would go to, but you don't expect that that's where life-changing things are happening. Right. And she said, no, this is where it matters. This is the place that it matters to be thinking about a human rights issue and how do we as society deal with somebody who did something horrific, which is murder somebody, but we now know that there's like a reason for it. What do you do? I also was reading this at a time when I was deciding to become a journalist and to see what you could do with a well-reported, well-written, and she's a very, very good writer. She is a very compelling writer. Somebody with a turn of phrase that you're just like, yeah, like that whole thing that you love in fiction when somebody is just a poet and captivating with some sort of description. You can do that in journalism. That's what she taught me. You can do that. Okay, well, that was a very elegant and lovely way to talk about Joan Didion. Next up, we have One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Ken Kesey. And so Ken Kesey was sort of he was the electric Kool-Aid acid test guy, you know? So he had a lot of cultural resonance within a certain sort of that counterculture in the, I think, late 60s, early 70s. But also was a writer and wrote not many books, but wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was the book I chose. And picking up that book, it was like, I was in 9th grade English and my teacher was like, yeah, you want to read it? Go read it. So I went and read it and I was like, fascinated by it. Yeah. It didn't feel like like a lot of literature, obviously, that I'd read to that point. It was counterculture and I didn't have a very good sense of what the counterculture even was. But the book itself is is it's about our desire to control things. And it also has the destructiveness of the outlaw who doesn't quite understand how destructive they are. But, and in that book, that is sort of the awakening is not the power, of the Nurse Ratched who finally gets it because she doesn't, but of somebody who's like, oh, I actually am very selfish and it really is all about me. And I really could take advantage of all these people and have been taking advantage of them for most of this story. But wait a minute, like I need to stand for something.
Yeah.
I need to understand these people somehow. They are the people around me. I need, people probably, many of them are familiar with the story. They probably saw the movie. But it is, and I think the movie is very good, but the book is, as all books, there's a lot more meditative stuff going on, a lot more internal, work that's going on that is being exposed, and a lot more color to the characters. And so I just found it to be, again, as somebody growing up and starting to think about what power meant and who had it and what it meant for somebody to have power and to use it in a way that is just about controlling things. It's like, I just don't want things to get out of hand, and it, reminds you of the parent. It reminds you of the government. It reminds you of a lot of the friend who, maybe is a little too controlling and you're like, what's going on here? And the worry that we all have of like, what if I'm out of control? Am I one of these patients? Am I crazy? It really was a great sort of visualizing of that internal angst of what's too far if I don't want to be part of, or just power structure.
I'm sadly haven't read the book and I'm only seen the movie, but just that visual of everyone just sedated and drugged up, and the drool coming down the side of Jack Nicholson's face.
Right.
Man.
Well, that's when you have to correct him so much that the electroshock therapy starts. And so and he, spoiler alert, but he has to be killed in the end because the one quiet observer through the whole thing, maybe it's a journalistic thing for me, but the one quiet observer who sort of been watching all of this finally decides he has to take action.
Yeah. Man, that makes me want to read that book. Okay, we have 2 more books here. Feels like those books were a little bit more young Gary. And I'm wondering if this next book is maybe older, wiser Gary. We've got Evan Osnos' Wildland. After a decade abroad, the National Book Award and Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Evan Osnos returns to 3 places he has lived in the United States: Greenwich, Connecticut, Clarksburg, West Virginia, and Chicago, Illinois, to illuminate the origins of America's political fury.
What he does in this book is he just does a great job of weaving together, back to the point I was kind of making, it was like not looking at America as like there's them and then there's us, and there's just like such easy divides. Talks about sort of the racial, elements of like, how do you emerge as a community that didn't have any power to try to have some power?
Right.
And are the people who are representing you actually representing the issues that, are of your community? Because of course, no community is monolithic. And so if it's to use, the just Black Americans living in Chicago, is the person emerging the right person? Is that really the topics you want to talk about? Or is it, you get it. So there's just the complications. And that's what he's trying to unpack is like, how did these power centers form in these 3 places? And in many ways, Chicago is the messy one where we're really trying to figure it out, the community organizer of Obama and who has the power, and how do you get past the sort of old guard and actually grab the power without doing something as corrupt as the people who had the power already. Okay. And then you have, Clarksburg, West Virginia, which was, and this is what he gives the sort of history of, like that was a main focal point of like culture in the United States. It was a big, rich city. And now you think of all of West Virginia as like a destroyed mine, right?
Right.
So the story is less about any one of these cities doing anything to another city. It's just how they are representative of what's going on in societies.
I got to tell you, I'm truly, genuinely going to also get this book.
Yes, it is very well written.
Because there's nothing that I love more than the story of something told through place. I just drove across America. What a crazy country we live in.
That's nuts. Well, and also the story sort of comes to that conclusion of like when you have so much concentration of wealth, you start to realize that distorts everything. And in a way, it's like, does it really matter what's happening in Chicago and Clarksburg?
No.
That's kind of the ultimate thing. It doesn't matter because there's people who their only interest is to make more money. And that interest is not a social upheaval interest. So while we're over here fighting on Twitter or X and whatever else about all of our social issues, the people who are concentrating the wealth and running things and putting money into the bank account of people running for president, for instance, they don't care about those things.
They sure are. And then they're going to get on a rocket ship to Mars.
Exactly.
And then the last book we have is, it's a really simple children's book. No, it's not. It is called Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, wildly abbreviated and cited as TLP. The only book-length philosophical work by the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. And that was published during his Wittgenstein. Yep. That was published during his lifetime. The project had a broad goal to identify the relationship between language and reality and to define the limits of science. Take us home, Gary. Take us home, baby.
Well, it's so Wittgenstein. This is a college book, and the reason I picked this one is Wittgenstein's a pretty smart guy. He was another World War, I think maybe one. vet. I think he's a World War I vet. And so part of his, like, the influence on him is sort of when the world's going on, you know, like, how did we get here into a place that is so logical? And I think that that's what a driving force for him as a thinker and a philosopher was, like, we got to make order of this thing. There's got to be something that explains what we're doing. And I think his effort in some ways was he wanted to sort of end philosophy. Let's stop all this banter. Here's the logical, mathematical truth. Here's how we get there. Here's how we do things. And surprisingly, that's not really an objective you can get to. And so as a young person, and we were being taught this with that context, so it wasn't something where I'm like, oh my God, this is like, I actually read it and I'm like, I don't really understand what he's trying to do here. And it's kind of boring. And he ends the book with a line like that, something to the effect of, that which we cannot speak about, we must be silent. You know, sort of like, I am ending this book on a powerful note of just shut up, because unless we can do like our rules and stuff, it's just not something we should even be talking about. And it was a really, like, so to me, like, the book it's more of a symbol of a desire we intellectual types have to put things in order and to finally figure it out and to think that there's something that's just like certain. Right. And it was really much more about perspective and how language works and how we use it. And he called it language games. And that philosophy, that thinking was very interesting to me, because it gave me sort of a context of the world where we can make sense to each other, and we are trying to make sense to each other. We're trying to make sense to ourselves. And language is a sort of weirdly imperfect, but what is perfect? And we need to stop taking shit so seriously and using words like Tractatus, Logico-Philosophicus, and start using real words that we talk to each other about and talk to each other like. And so, so it was really, to me, a really impactful understanding of what philosophy could be. And while it's great to go into academia and it's great to sort of separate yourself to give time to think things through, or even when you're writing a book to separate yourself and be able to like meditate and concentrate. At the same time, don't disconnect yourself from the rest of this.
So you hear that? You hear that, academics in your ivory tower? Let's take it to the masses. Let's take it to the unwashed masses. Gary, this was a great conversation. Just to remind everyone, the 5 books that made Gary Scott: A Light in August by William Faulkner, Slouching Towards Bethlehem by Joan Didion, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Kesey, Wildland, Evan Osnos, and TLP. Everyone, I'm Britt. This is Gary Scott.
Gary.
This is Gary, and this has been another episode of the Bookwise Podcast, the books that maybe from bookclub.com.